Okay, good morning. My name is Julian Morris. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and Chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. Today, as part of our statutory review of the NWT Heritage Act, we're pleased to welcome Stephen Thompson, Acting Assistant Deputy Minister, and Brittany Jones, Director of Investment Strategy at the Department of Treasury Board and Finance of the Government Alberta. They are here to provide a presentation on the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Today's meeting is public and being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone to direct all comments and questions to me as the chair, especially for witnesses. We've got someone in the booth operating microphones, so it just makes the conversation go smoother if you just wait for the mic to turn on. I'll just now ask members to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Hawkins, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Hawkins. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife Centre, and as always, I'm happy to be here, as well as to welcome our millions of subscribers on our social media channels, and we know they're out there because they send the messages. Anyway, thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Danny Rogers. I'm the member for Nuvik Boot Lake, and welcome. Excited to hear your presentation.
Good morning. I am Kate Reed. I'm the MLA for Great Slave here in Yellowknife, one of multiple Yellowknife ridings. So pleased you could be with us in person. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, members. So Mr. Thompson and Ms. Jones, without any further ado, please proceed with your presentation, and then we'll move on to questions from MLAs. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be up here. We've had a wonderful time so far in Yellowknife. People have been very welcoming. Air Canada, not so much, but here we are. So thanks for having us. We've had a very interesting journey of late with the Heritage Fund, and we're undergoing a fairly significant renewal and reformation of how the fund is managed, revisiting what its mandate is, and sort of our plans for the future for the fund, which we will walk through. I have a bit of an agenda. So thank you. And I was told not to do what I just did. So we'll go through this in too much detail, but basically what we'd like to do today is talk about the formation of the fund, its history, some of the changes and challenges that we've seen with it over the years, where we've had a sort of seminal change in how we're viewing the fund, the new mandate that we have from the Premier in terms of its growth and its future. And then Brittany will talk, Ms. Jones, my colleague, will talk about some of the investment strategies that we're going to be employing going forward that may be of interest to you for your own fund. I do realize that the fund up here, the Heritage Fund for the Northwest Territories, is based largely on the Heritage Fund in Alberta. So we're happy to share what we've learned, and we're delighted to talk to you about where we think we're going with it, because we have some really exciting plans for this that I think you'll find interesting. So the Heritage Fund was formed by Premier Peter Lougheed in 1976 with an initial investment of $2.2 billion and a commitment to divert 30% of natural resource revenues into the fund annually. And it continued that way for a few years. Part of the mandate of the fund was economic development, so making investments in Alberta. So to this day, you will see grain cars with the Alberta Heritage Fund logo on them. You will see some buildings that were built by the Heritage Fund, hospitals and such. Fairly early on, the fund moved away from that mandate and focused more on investment and growth of investments. The early mandate of the fund is to strengthen and diversify the Albertan economy and to be an intergenerational transfer of resource wealth to future generations of Albertans, recognizing that there is a finite amount of oil in the ground. And as wealthy as they were in the 70s, there was a recognition even back then that this would not last forever. So Peter Lougheed's been given a lot of credit for foresight. In Alberta, you wouldn't do well to insult the man. The fund has actually withstood the test of time. It's been battered by some challenging times fiscally for the province, some interesting investment return decisions. But it's been there for however many years ago 1976 was. And Albertans haven't always appreciated it, haven't always remembered that it exists. But the moment a government talks about touching it or cashing it in or changing it, Albertans come to the fore and protect their fund. So it's ingrained in our culture now, which I think is very important for its longevity and its purpose. So here's the preamble to the Act. This sort of acts as the cornerstone of our belief in the fund to provide prudent stewardship to the savings from Alberta's non-renewable resources by providing the greatest financial returns on those savings for current and future generations of Albertans. And the powerful line from our perspective in here is providing the greatest financial returns, because that allows us as stewards of the fund to focus solely on investment return. And one of the greatest challenges we've had over the last decade or so is when the fiscal times become lean, there is a temptation to either move money out of the fund and into revenue, or to convert the fund into an economic development tool. And that's not to say that there aren't investments in Alberta that yield superior financial returns. There are, and we do invest in those. But the direction of the fund is to look at the global investment universe and achieve the maximum possible financial returns to grow the fund as large as possible. So we are constantly coming back to the Act, and having those words enshrined in the legislation has been a very powerful tool for protecting the assets in the fund. Here's some key dates. I won't run through all of these. But as I said, in 1976, the fund was launched with the idea that it would grow, save for the future, but also invest in economic development. After the first few years, those economic development investments petered away, and the focus returned almost exclusively to investment return. But as I said, the province has had fiscal ups and downs. The boom-bust cycle of oil is well known. The impact of natural resource revenues on the provincial budget is very significant. I mean, to this day, it's 20% of the revenue in the budget, and it was even more in the early days. So in 1982, during lean fiscal times, the decision was made to lower the contribution rate into the fund from 30% of natural resource revenues to 15%. And that carried on for 5 years until 1987, when no contributions were made into the fund at all. And so the fund languished at its basic level, earning small investment returns until the 90s. And then in the 90s, what happened again was leaner fiscal times, and the earnings from the fund began to be drawn out. So as the fund earned investment returns, those monies were drawn and placed in general revenue to be used for general purposes, just to balance the budget. And that model continued until 2021. And the Heritage Fund contributed annually into the provincial revenues between $1 to $2.5 billion annually. And it created some issues in the investment of the fund, because every year we would earn $1 billion or $2 billion worth of investment returns, and that cash would be drawn out of the fund. So what it meant was you had to be invested in things that you could sell in exchange for cash. So it skewed the asset mix of the fund, it skewed the investment philosophy of the fund, and it made for a more challenging investment environment. So liquidity was a concern for that fund, the ability to take cash out. In 2021, under the current government, the decision was made to stop drawing the funds out, to stop drawing the revenue out of the funds. And since that time, the fund has grown more than we've seen in decades. And we'll get into that a bit.
Over $5 billion has been saved since we
2021.
reinvested since we made that decision.
And so this is where our work has become interesting lately, because The legislation was amended in 2022-23 fiscal year, so that the default was to leave revenue in the fund and reinvest those returns and grow the fund. So that has implications for investment strategy, obviously, because we no longer have to worry as much about being in liquid investments. So we can move away from things like bonds, liquid equities, and into more liquid strategies. Additionally, the province made the decision to enact a fiscal framework more broadly. And part of the wording of the fiscal framework, it's a balanced budget legislation, essentially. It says, first of all, the province shouldn't run deficits. If it does run a deficit, it has to return to balance within 3 years. And that's the situation we're facing right now. But where there is a surplus, the allocation of surplus cash is laid out in the Act, the Fiscal Framework Act, so that 50% of any surplus cash must be used to repay maturing debt, so to reduce the province's overall debt load. And the remaining 50% may also be used to reduce debt or to be contributed into the Heritage Fund and invested. And our advice to government is generally to put as much as they can into the Heritage Fund, because the returns on the fund far exceed the debt servicing costs of carrying the existing debt. We don't always win that argument, but that's our advice to government. So under that framework, we've just contributed an extra $2 billion into the fund. It's the first contribution into the fund since
753 last year.
It was 753, yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
But really, since 2005, there were no
Yeah.
contributions.
So this first investment was made since 2005, in 2021. So I forget about the 753 million. So we've been making contributions, and we expect an additional $1 billion to be contributed this year based on year-end cash position. And you can see the Heritage Fund growth chart there. What we haven't included is, if you look at the previous 15 years or so, that first bar would have just been a flat line back in time. The fund wouldn't have grown at all, other than some inflation proofing that we were required to do. It really does have a lag. So why was revitalization needed? The problem was that the fund wasn't getting the attention that it deserved. We've been managing, so Ms. Jones and I at the Department of Treasury, Board and Finance, have basically been responsible for this fund since we started, so for 10 years. The fund is, the Minister of Finance is responsible for the fund. He's the shareholder of the fund, or the trustee. And under the current system, there is no dedicated governance or oversight function for the Heritage Fund. It sits within the Department of Treasury, Board and Finance. Ms. Jones and I will prepare the asset allocations. We will draw up the statement of investment policies and goals. We will forward them to the minister for approval. They will be, reviewed by departmental staff. And then those investment policies are given to AIMCO, who acts as our investment manager, and AIMCO implements the investment strategy through as our investment manager through their pooled structure. So our investments are commingled with the investments of all of the Alberta pensions and managed by AIMCO. But to properly manage a fund like this, it needed dedicated governance and oversight. And so what we've been doing recently is working on that. So we would like to move the governance of the fund out of the department. We will be moving the governance of the fund out of the department into an independent corporation. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And one of the problems with the way that we have governed to date, honestly, is that we have ministers of varying financial acumen. And so when we come with complex investment policy decisions, it often depends on the audience as to what we can and cannot do. So it would be good to remove that variability in oversight.
And leave it up to a board of directors, especially fit for it.
Yeah, I hope he's not watching. For the record, our current minister has exceptional financial acumen, and it's under his watch that we've been allowed to make these significant and important changes. So that leads us to this. So what we are creating is called the Heritage Fund Opportunities Corporation. And this corporation will have an independent board of directors. The board of directors will be evenly split between Albertan experts in investments and international experts with experience with sovereign wealth funds and other investment funds. We have a slate of candidates. It's not been publicly released yet, but we expect to stand that up in the coming weeks so we can share all that with you. It has been announced that Joe Lougheed will be the chair of the board of the Heritage Fund Opportunities Corporation, and he is in fact Peter Lougheed's son. So there's a nice continuity there. And he's a well-respected Albertan lawyer out of Calgary. And what's important with the Opportunities Corporation is that it will have a singular purpose, and that is to govern and grow the Heritage Fund. And it will have responsibility for the development of the statements of investment policies and goals. It will have oversight over the investments managed by AIMCO, which is managing what we're now calling the legacy portfolio, because some of the new contributions that we're making will be managed directly by the Heritage Fund Opportunities Corporation itself. So there is an expectation that this corporation will also have investment management expertise within the management and staff that will directly manage some of these funds, basically all of the new funds that go into it. The reason we're leaving the legacy funds with AIMCO is because there are optimizations that we can make around the portfolio as it exists. And if we were to pull all of those assets out of AIMCO, it would actually be disruptive to some of their other clients, which would impact government pensions and other clients, which is not our intention. And we actually do have faith in AIMCO as an investment manager, but we feel that under proper guidance from this corporation, they can be a better investment manager because they'll be more engaged with professional staff. These you can actually read. I mean, the drivers of success for HFOC are going to be the ability to make strategic investment decision. For example, right now, if we were to make a significant investment in any particular asset, we would probably need to take it up to the Minister of Finance for sign-off. And again, it would be basically briefing on what kind of investment it is, why we want to make it. And generally, by the time we've gotten approval to make one of those investments, it's no longer profitable to do so. So we're hoping that there will be some speed associated with the professionalism of the corporation. The global partnerships, I was mentioning to one of your members earlier, earlier this year, or last year, actually, late last year, we took the minister to Singapore and Tokyo to meet with some sovereign wealth funds that are located there. And just those meetings alone, we made inroads into partnering on strategic investments globally. And that's just us managing it off the corner of our desk. So with a properly mandated corporation with a global investment mandate, the road is quite clear that we can partner with existing sovereign wealth funds for enhanced returns on some investments that frankly you wouldn't be able to participate in as a pension fund investment or a regular investment manager. There is an element of exclusivity to the sovereign wealth fund world, and we feel that having this corporation in place is sort of the key into that clubhouse. And then governance. Governance, as I said, it has been weak for the Heritage Fund. It's been very easy to change the mandate as governments change, and as ministers change and the attention to the fund changes. So with a corporation solely dedicated to managing the fund, we feel that it'll have sort of a consistency over time, and there'll be less ability for political interference going forward. And size matters at the end of the day. And our fund is getting to the size where it does matter, and it can make investments that it couldn't before. We'll get a little bit into the investment side of it, and we won't go through all of the details. Ms. Jones has most of the knowledge around this one, but I'll talk to the overview. So this is what the current investment portfolio looks like. It's $25 billion that's invested. If you look at the asset mix, you have any familiarity with investing, you'll notice that it looks an awful lot like a pension fund. And that's because it's commingled with AIMCO's clients, who are mostly pension funds outside of the Heritage Fund. We have a few other issues, but and so by default, because it hasn't had the strategic oversight that it requires, it's drifted into this world that is managed like a pension. And then the difference between a pension fund and a sovereign wealth fund fundamentally is that pension funds have ongoing disbursement requirements. So they have to pay out constantly to existing members. The way we're viewing the sovereign wealth fund is that it doesn't pay out at all until we reach either a critical mass, a critical point in time, or a critical size that we've predetermined. So what we'd like to do is shift this investment portfolio to something that has much more long-term growth potential, less liquidity. My view on that, frankly, is that if you have highly illiquid investments, in terms of fiscal crisis, it's very hard for government to access them. The reason it's been rated before is that if we're holding a lot of bonds, they're very easy to sell. You can convert that to cash and transfer it over to general revenue quite readily. So we would like to make that as difficult as possible. But it also aligns nicely with the long-term growth trajectory. So investing in these illiquids that grow over time. You have to have an exit strategy for them, but the exit strategy can be decades away. So, yeah. And in terms of our target, this was one that the Premier announced without telling us recently on sort of, this was the impetus of the Reformation. We had done some research and we had worked with some external consultants on how we can reframe the Heritage Fund and what is possible. And so this was sort of the median scenario that we modeled, and the advice we received from the consultants and some of our own work was that if we simply stopped withdrawing funds from the Heritage Fund, reinvested all of the earnings, we could hit $250 billion by 2050. And that assumes basically a 9% rate of return over the 25 years that we're investing. And it increases the fund obviously tenfold from where we're starting. And you can see on the bottom, it requires no additional contributions into the fund. So if we do make additional contributions in, then we either reach our 250 target more quickly, or we simply have more at the end of 2050. And we chose both the number, the 250 billion, and the 2050 target after sort of thinking about what it is we want to do. And so 250 billion became important because if we look at that out to 2050, assuming that we've had a drop in natural resource revenues, assuming that some of our oil royalties go away, 20% of our budget is going to disappear if all of it goes away. So if half of it goes away, we can replace it with a dividend from this fund. So on 250 billion, you could easily throw out 10 to 15 billion a year in revenue without depleting the principal that's available at the time. And the reason we picked 2050 is it's simply aligned with the province's stated target for reaching carbon neutrality, which is 15 years later than the federal government, but we feel it's more believable and more achievable. And certainly for Alberta, it's probably more realistic to take longer. So that's how those two targets were determined and aligned. And so I did speak a fair bit about this. You know, we have evolving investment objectives. So up until now, the objective has been to maximize return so that we could draw it out and draw it into general revenue. And that's changing into we want to maximize investment return so that the fund grows to the maximum size possible by 2050. So we're going to do things differently is basically what we're saying. And
I can jump in.
no, please do.
Oh, sorry.
It's still-
Thank you. And where this gets very interesting as well, so in the second point, refining our asset allocation and risk management, is that transitioning to this growth portfolio is a dual mandate for HFOC. First of all, they have to work more collaboratively with AIMCO to come up with some solutions that haven't been done before. It's an exciting time. There's conversations we'll be able to have on that, but also balance the risk of what HFOC is able to do as well too. We will get into some private investment conversation in the next couple slides, but this is where it gets really, really interesting because we think about all of the universe of opportunities that we have across all different types of investment products. And that was really, just further to Steve's point, what was really exciting about HFOC because like AIMCO's doing a fantastic job, but its clients really are all clients that had liabilities before. And now, so this is a new realm for all of us to be able to look at these a different way. But just wanted to highlight how important risk management in all of this is going to be as well too, especially in this. So,
Great points.
yeah.
Thank you for that. So no, and one thing I would like to say, because I've mentioned this a few times, we've sounding very critical of having drawn all of the earnings out of the fund and put them into general revenue. And we don't think that that is appropriate, and that's not what we're recommending going forward. But if you look at the history of the fund and what it's contributed to the province, that represents about $45 billion in revenue that didn't have to be raised through taxes or didn't have to be raised through debt. So it has left the province in a stronger fiscal position. But we don't think that that was sort of the maximum utility of the fund. So it's not to criticize sort of fiscal decisions of the past. We weren't there for those. We're changing them now. So we're also going to talk about return objectives, and this is our current benchmark is CPI plus 450 basis points, which AIMCO generally meets, give or take. And this is typically how fund performance is measured for pension managers, and honestly for most sovereign wealth funds too. And we haven't changed that as yet, but our recommendation actually is to change it to more of a target objective. And simply our target is to hit 250 billion by 2050. And so the benchmark is really anything that moves you forward towards that. Because the problem with the CPI plus 450 benchmark is if you're measuring that this week even, every time Mr. Trump opens his mouth, we're losing money. But you're still outperforming by not losing as much money. And that is not really constructive if you're trying to grow the fund. It's great for outperformance. It gets your managers paid. Their bonuses are based on that. But it doesn't do anything for your terminal wealth. So we're looking at different ways of measuring that. We haven't landed on a well-rounded one as yet. But we would like to develop new measures that sort of recognize the journey rather than the outperformance. And this is just a little bit about the additional $2 billion that's just been transferred over to the Heritage Fund from last year's surplus cash. So this money will be invested by the Heritage Fund Opportunities Corporation, separate from AIMCO, and with a completely separate mandate, a completely separate statement of investment policies and goals. And what makes this one exciting is this $2 billion is what our investment managers would call dry powder. We can do whatever we want with it. We don't have to. Up until now, what we've been doing is basically just deploying it into the portfolio proportionally across everything that's already existing. So this $2 billion will be what we call the new portfolio versus the legacy portfolio. And it's sort of a secondary mandate for the Heritage Fund Opportunities Corporation to outperform the legacy portfolio by investing strategically in global partnerships, in those liquid assets that we talked about, in strategic investments that are designed to outperform in the long run. So we may take hits up front in terms of valuations, but in the long run, we're expecting returns well in excess of what we would achieve through a traditional portfolio asset mix. And we have the luxury of time with the sovereign wealth fund is really sort of the crux of the argument. So if you look at a fund like Norway, which actually doesn't perform all that well in terms of returns, it's a massive fund. It's the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. It's over $2 trillion now. One of my criticisms of them, frankly, is that they don't have a terminal value. They don't know when to stop. They will grow that fund forever. They invest in the entire investable universe outside of Norway, but they still maintain the highest tax rates in Western Europe. They have great services. Don't get me wrong. It's a wonderful place to live, but that money actually has no purpose other than to grow. There's no thought of when that might pay out. So they have $2 trillion, and frankly, they're not doing anything with it. And that's not what our goal is here. Like, we would like to maintain Albertans' standard of life when oil is gone. I think that's a noble goal. So we'll talk to the Norwegians at some point. We'll see how we do first. So we're going to get a little more into the weeds of
Oh, good timing. Yeah.
they're angry. Yeah. Well, millions of followers, you say. So I'm going to hand it over to Ms. Jones to talk a little bit more about the portfolio approach, the investment strategy, and a little bit about the value of privates and illiquids.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Thompson. So Steve did a great job explaining how we got here, which is fantastic. And now what I really want to talk to you about is when we went through all of your presentations, we really thought that focusing on the investment strategy was something that would be very interesting for you. One of the things that Canada has been fantastic at is creating the Canadian pension model, and that Canadian pension model has given us the gift of really understanding the private investment universe. Right now, we saw that your portfolio has moved into equities, which is fantastic, and you have the portfolio there. You have your strategic asset allocation, and this is typically how investments have done. This comes from the Markowitz days, and this is how asset modeling has been done. So typically, an investment policy is made with the strategic asset allocation. Investment manager can work within bands, and that's how everything is done. Risk, return, everything is bucketed into these asset classes. But the thing is that things are changing now. Things are changing in the investment landscape. We're seeing right now with all of the volatility in markets, there's things that we can do and opportunities that we're seeing. We're also seeing, when you look at it just from an asset class standpoint, there's different factors that are actually applicable in different ways. So you might be taking the same risk in fixed income as you are in equities, as you are in a real estate asset class, and not even knowing it in certain ways. So one of the things that we're doing is we're really starting to deconstruct the whole SAA, we call it our strategic asset allocation, the way that we were doing things, which is kind of a set it and forget it method. You give the bands, to more of a total portfolio approach. And the difference with a total portfolio approach is it's really a combination of investment governance and investment thinking. So before, you had these asset classes that were definitely, they knew what they were doing, the portfolio managers were very competent, but they were always focusing on their investment asset classes because they want to invest the dry powder that Steve is talking about. But we need to think about things a little bit more of a competition for capital. And that's where the governance comes in. And that's where, when we start looking at HFOC and what we hope for this and the culture of HFOC is that you have a very CIO-centric view of things. And Steve had mentioned we're looking more towards a probability-based benchmark. What are we doing that's taking us closer to our goal every day? Not, are we losing less money than the S&P right now? because that's not what we're focused on, right? And so this leads to a lot of different creative conversations, and the idea around this is really to bring all the voices to the table that have good ideas and find ways to execute on those. So if it doesn't fall in your traditional asset class bucket, we don't want to just say we can't take advantage of that opportunity because it's not in our allocation strategy. We want everybody to come to the table. And so governance has been one of the really big things that we've been talking about with all of this as well. I'm getting used to this. So what a sample process might look like, that's a little bit different. First, you'd start with setting your risk targets, then your exposure targets, your strategy targets, select investments, and then balance your total portfolio. So traditionally, when we were looking at the SAA approach, rebalancing was really a decision that was being made because you were outside of the bands that you had set based on this set it and forget it strategy. Whereas now when we look at balancing the total portfolio, it's not always balancing back to those ranges. It's looking forward all the time. It's looking at what do we want to do when we rebalance. Maybe these moves were good moves. Maybe the overweights that we're seeing we want to keep. And so really changing the conversation around this it makes a big difference. So the considerations being governance to achieve better group consensus, a factor lens that we talked about. So what factors are inherent? It could be credit risk. It could be other types of, basically all different types of risks. We can look at all different things. Where is that popping up in my portfolio and where do I want to take those risks and what's going to pay off the best? The competition for capital relying on judgment, independence, and objectivity, I think we really believe with HFOC that that's what's going to propel the Heritage Fund further as far as good ideas and bringing that to the table. And then the culture really needs to be around the long-termism, agility, and focus of meeting our target return. So this new approach is very much based on the future. I'm not sure what's going on with this slide, but this basically takes us to the realm of private investments. In the 90s, thank you. I don't know why it's doing that. But in the 90s, we saw portfolios really constructed of a lot of public assets. Now the world of private assets is becoming a lot more accessible to funds of any size. So you don't have to be billions and billions of dollars to think about private investments. And so what this slide was basically trying to articulate is what the amount of advisors that currently use things that we all know about, so mutual funds, ETFs, those types of things, and then goes all the way down to cryptocurrency, which is clearly something that people don't understand as well, so they don't use it as much. And then the last column shows, the middle column shows the amount of advisors that are thinking about using different things. This is actually one of my favorite conversations to have at conferences with other allocators is, where are you looking to allocate that you haven't looked to allocate before? Where are you seeing these areas of opportunity? And the thing with private investments is that we've seen that they've actually outperformed public investments over the long term. And further to Steve's point as well too about locking money away so that it can't be spent. When you're a sovereign wealth fund, you have a gift of an infinite time horizon. And so a lot of these investments could be meaningful for you as well. The reasons to use alternative investments, we've gone over most of them. So portfolio diversification. Volatility is one of the more controversial aspects, I would say, about private investments, because generally speaking, they're less volatile, which means less risk. So you can see your risk return profile actually go up quite substantially when you add private investments into the mix, while also reducing volatility and drawdown risk, which is huge for a sovereign wealth fund, and especially one that could potentially be in the news and have headline risk, and you have people watching, right? Nobody wants to see those big downsides. The flip side of that is the potential tail risk in some of these things. So like one of the assets we held was London City Airport. Well, when COVID hits an airport, there's only so much you can do, right? Income generation is a big one. Growth and enhanced return opportunity, and the inflation hedge is also one thing that has really protected our portfolio for a long time with these as well. Reducing the exposure to public markets, as we talked about, and really, this last one, demonstrating our own value proposition, this is really important for HFOC, and this is something where we've actually focused a lot on what the Alberta identity looks like throughout this as well too, and what type of investments would actually make money, maximize returns, but also be something that Albertans are proud of. What does Albertans want to hold? What can we do? What can we invest in that's propelling returns, but also creating a value proposition of HFOC for the public? So what's in it for Alberta at the end of the day? This is just a slide, and I won't go over everything, but one thing that we have noticed is that private investments do seem scary sometimes, and it's not a conversation that's always being had. It's a lot easier to build a portfolio built on liquid investments, but definitely something that has benefited us. So this takes us to the lessons we have learned. Sounds good. All right, so this is just a quick recap. We've covered most of these things already, but we just wanted to give you the key lessons that we've learned throughout all of this. So reinvesting income propels growth. $5 billion saved this year. We went from $17 billion to over 27 now, and the growth is very, very exciting. The key messages here is using legislation to our advantage, as you have been doing as well. The contribution consistency makes an impact. That's something that we were very impressed when we read the documentation on what you guys have been doing, because there has been consistent contributions into the fund, which is clearly benefiting you. We're seeing the big impact of that as well, but we also understand that this is a yearly fiscal decision, especially on the in Alberta. So if we can keep up the surplus contributions, it's great. Asset mix choices matter. So there's some CFA research out there that your asset mix drives 90% of your returns, 80%, 90% of your returns. So the asset mix choices really matter. And adding alternative investments like infrastructure, private equity type investments really does help diversify risk and give you that inflation protection. We've seen the benefits of a diversified portfolio over the years. And then going into the asset mix, we talked about that total portfolio approach, and that's something that I'm extremely excited about. There's different financial designations throughout the system, and he's a CFA charter holder, and I have something called the Chartered Alternative Asset or Investment Analyst designation, and they're doing a ton of research on this total portfolio strategy, and this, I really like where the industry is moving on that, especially as an investment professional. And then external and peer support. One of the big things that we realized was 2 people in the department was kind of tough, and we needed to bring somebody in from the outside to really help us push some of these ideas forward. The other thing too is they brought really great thought leadership into the system as well too. We've learned so much about governance and now are so excited about that aspect of this all. That's very important as well. And then that takes us to our last point, that governance drives performance. So our 10-year return on the Heritage Fund is just under 8%. And like Steve had mentioned, we're looking at returns of 9%. So when the conversation is, well, how are you going to do it? Well, asset mix definitely matters. We talked about that. But governance is also a big driver of returns as well, too. Smarter decision making, as well as governance of investments, where HFOC can hopefully take a more active approach to managing some of its investments, and that should also drive returns as well. And that takes us to question period.
Okay. Thank you very much. I personally have so much to say and ask about, but yeah, really appreciate the presentation, but I'll go to committee first. Who wants to? I'll go to Mr. Rogers first for questions.
Yeah, no, excellent presentation. Likely, Mr. Chair, I would say one of my favorite presentations so far since I've been in as an MLA. I'm a bit of an investment nerd, so this is really interesting stuff, and I have a bunch of questions I can ask, but I'll just go to one first. You talked about, you know, your current investment strategy, which you've done very well, obviously, and that's likely been, I'm assuming this is now prior to coming into your new kind of global strategy versus just looking at the indices and just using mutual funds and ETFs. So obviously you expect to continue to grow as much or even more based on your new strategy. And anybody who's been involved in the investment world know you have your J.P. Morgans and your Bank of Ireland's, and they line up and they say, well, if they're doing well against the indice, then they're amazing, and if not, well, it doesn't favor our investment style right now. So you're going to kind of not push that away totally, but say, listen, that's not as important to us. So obviously you're going to have some likely really good analysis people on your board. You would have to, but I'm just wondering a little more, I guess, around what you've learned, I guess, or what the analysis has been done around the risk of that strategy, because obviously that, I would think, would come with a little more risk than just basically sticking with the indices, sticking with the traditional way, we'll say, of investing those funds, and understanding that, of course, some of those funds had liabilities with them, and you don't, so it's a little different. You don't have to maintain that. You don't have to have your actuary in saying how much you need to, if you're underfunded or overfunded, obviously, but just, yeah, a little, maybe if you could expand a little more on the kind of the risk analysis done to that new strategy.
Okay, thank you. Oh, go ahead. This is where the whole chairing thing is in with the mics. But anyways, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm historically not great at this anyways, even I've been going to our standing committees for 10 years, but the risk question is a fantastic question because this, to me, investments and risk go so hand in hand, right? You can't do one without the other. And that's actually one of the biggest challenges that we're thinking about in the background right now is how to deal with risk, because there's definitely a system element for sure, but there's also an opportunity element because you're taking the risk, there's the opportunity behind it, and the integration with a portfolio that already exists. So, deconstructing this into the sum of its parts is actually what we're doing right now, and then reconstructing it into a total portfolio view so that we actually really understand everything that's moving. But I think one of the biggest things is going to be the system that gets chosen at the end of the day, how that works, and what the feedback loop looks like. How do we know that this system is aggregating all the elements, all the characteristics of these different assets that we're putting together, giving us the feedback loop that we need, and then we're adjusting the way that we want to. One of the elements of this that we didn't get super into is the SAA is typically built on 10-year returns. So you're looking out longer. But then there's tactical asset allocations, which are 1 to 3 type year, 1 year, and then the dynamic, which is, within that 1 to 5 year range. What we're looking at here is ways of using that as well to protect the downside. So, you want to try to be resilient in moving markets like this. You did mention the benchmarks as well, and that is also a challenge because that feeds into the risk element as well too. So how do you actually measure risk? And this is a conversation we're going to have with auditors and all of that as well too, right? So how do you do that? So there's definitely an element of still using benchmarks, for sure, but also going to Steve's point before, that probability approach that we're talking about and the different measures of moving there, those are things we're exploring as well too. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, but definitely a proper system and a proper processes and internal controls around that is going to be absolutely key to managing the risk.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogers, follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and you mentioned in your presentation you're still working around that risk side, which is I find fascinating and very, very interesting to go for that new approach. On your and I like the fact that right now I think you have close to 50% in equities. I'm assuming you've pulled all your U.S. equities, but then your foreign equity. You said foreign equities. I didn't see U.S. in there, so I'm assuming you've yanked that out. Oh yeah. So, but. Yeah, so I'm because one of the conversations we've had is around what portion should be in those, riskier by, equity versus bonds versus, the money markets. Are you constrained at all around any kind of ethical investing? Do you get to that level? Is that something that's in your investment strategy, or do you just kind of, hey, here's the dry powder, as you say, and go make the most money you can, and if that means we're investing in Rothmans or investing in, so be it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Over to the presenters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, it's an excellent question, and it's one that Alberta particularly has some sensitivities around. We've often been accused of being anti-ESG rather than pro anything, and it's simply not the case. I mean, We do have a responsible investment policy. It is obviously less focused on, say, green bonds or anti-energy sort of investments. So there are opportunities to invest in the energy sector, particularly, and then this is where those ethical sort of investment questions invariably lead when you're talking to Alberta. There are opportunities to invest in the enhancement of production of energy in Alberta, for example, that are not necessarily sort of going to be in an ESG portfolio. They're not going to be in a green portfolio. But it doesn't mean that they are pro-dirty oil or anti-anything. They're simply significant opportunities for excess financial return. But when we look at investments, we don't use an exclusionary screen. We don't exclude ourselves from investing in certain things. I mean, we have exclusions on, I believe we still have an exclusion on tobacco and on military equipment. But other than that, we don't limit ourselves. But it doesn't mean that we don't have a responsible investment lens. It simply means that we weigh that against our financial returns. So do we invest in Russia? No. Do we invest in the responsible development of oil, enhanced energy? Yes, we do. Do we invest in wind, solar, and other renewables? Yes, but only if we feel they'll be profitable.
Okay, thank you. I have Ms. Reid next for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. Much like Mr. Rogers, it's by far blowing a lot of presentations we've seen out of the water, so good job, you. But he also stole part of my question, but that's okay. I'll pivot. So it's interesting to hear that you don't have exclusionary screens on investment except for those two that you mentioned, which maybe not an exclusionary screen, but just sort of you don't do it. Fair enough. But I guess to continue that conversation a little bit, and you did touch upon some of your proposed governance changes, is there any contemplation around how regular Albertans have like public input into the process of how the government is investing? Do you go out and have these conversation inflection points? And if you could speak a little bit more to that. I know there's a real interest from a certain percentage of Northerners to have input into our process as we are looking at revitalizing our heritage fund. So be curious to know what you folks are up to. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an excellent question. And we've had, over the years, we have seen various polling done of the public around the Heritage Fund. The last official engagement was in the 90s. That's when Alberta said that they wanted it to exist in 1995. Basically, that they wanted it to exist, they wanted it to grow. When it comes to actual investment, we try and steer away from too much public input because everybody knows somebody, everybody knows something, and we would much rather that those conversations were made around made by investment professionals with an eye to return. That said, we do know that Albertans are very protective of the Heritage Fund. They want it to exist. And what we've seen as we rolled out the new strategies and the new growth targets and sort of introduced the new Opportunities Corporation, that the public is getting more and more engaged in it. And we absolutely want this fund to reflect the values and the goals of Albertans. And when we say that we want this to be an intergenerational transfer of wealth, we want there to be the same standard of living for our grandchildren when we can no longer rely on non-renewable resource revenues. We do that with input from the public. And I believe you will see, and we haven't committed to anything, but I believe you will see more public engagement as the corporation is stood up. There will be more marketing campaigns. There have been suggestions that we make a retail product available to Albertans so that they can participate on a personal level into the Heritage Fund. We haven't done a lot of work on it. It's an idea that that has favor with the politicians, and that the public really do want to be part of this. And so if we can engage the public in that way, if we can say that you as an Albertan or as a Canadian, maybe we don't limit it to Alberta, can invest in the Heritage Fund and have excellent returns. You have that engagement from the public, and then as an investment manager and as a government, you would have no choice but to listen to your constituents on that. And I think that would give them a much more powerful voice than simply writing angry letters to the minister when they see something they don't like. You would see much more involvement on the public level. So that's something that we could be doing. It's in our list of potential projects for when the fund is up and running properly. But I will say that because of the announcements being made quite publicly by the Premier, Albertans are listening, they're interested, and whether we choose to engage with them in an official capacity or not, we will hear from them.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Reid, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and that's absolutely fascinating. I think we're, as a territory, light years away from having an investment product on our fund, but that's a fascinating concept, and I will be tracking what you folks end up doing because I'm absolutely intrigued and would probably want to invest in such a product should it exist. Yeah, no, I really do appreciate your comments on public input, and I think it's so crucial to have that conversation because, as you've noted many times throughout your presentation and comments, that this is really an intergenerational fund and it's for the public. So it makes sense that the public should be involved in a meaningful way. So I don't really have a question there, it's more of a comment, but thank you so much for that.
Thank you. I just note that Mr. Rogers has to go. Did you want to make any closing comments, Mr. Rogers, before you leave?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I apologize. I had a previous meeting at 11:30. Again, I'd love to sit and pick your brain for a couple of hours, which is, I'm sure, would be amazing, but certainly really appreciate the presentation. I do have an offer if you'd like to build a gas pipeline all the way to Inuvik. We've got about 19 trillion up there now we're waiting to ship out somewhere, so we can have a conversation, do some of that dry powder, we can get rid of that.
Give them your business card and go away.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So with that aside, I have Mr. Hawkins next for questions.
So when you come late into the question zone, you lose the, we'll take some of your investment money, you lose the ESG question and the public engagement question. So it's pretty tough to come up with something. Not impossible for me, I'm just saying tough. So there's a couple areas, maybe I'll just speak broadly to it, is I agree with the public engagement needs to be limited, and the reason is it's the old adage, too many cooks in the kitchen, right? And although people may mean well, and I hope they do, and I maybe generally speaking do believe they mean well, the challenge, of course, is do they have those years of experience and expertise to be able to read the markets like, Nostradamus predicted the future? I don't know. But, in the sense of all seriousness, it's a complicated thing, a lot of guesswork, but guesswork's also built with years of experience and proven results. So that said, yeah, I can appreciate public input. Should be limited. But that's in the specific management, I would view it as. But the principles of the fund, I think, really, in our view, or certainly in my view, should be open to public engagement and regular public engagement. And I find it interesting on your comment with respect to ESGs, and I was going to ask that question as well, is how do you determine that? It sounds like you have a lot of discretion there. And I suspect, I mean, if the objective is to grow the fund, I mean, the question is how serious do you want to get, and what dirty laundry do you want to carry with it at the same time? And I appreciate you pointing out, I think you said Russia. Yeah, I was going to use the same example. Yeah, we can make more money off diamonds with Russia, but that said, what player do we look like internationally? So I can appreciate that. So, Mr. Chairman, I did find a question or two to focus in on. On their slide 6, that's our package, page 9, there was a point there noting about the surplus contributions. And just curious, although this isn't your area, but is it, our surplus is used for capital plan. So we don't have at one time it was 50% and then we could borrow 50%. So the short example is if we wanted to buy a giant grader or invest in a road, 50% had to come from the surplus and 50% could be leveraged through borrowing money. That said, the current climate has shifted to 100% of the surplus. So, I mean, we don't have a lot of surplus sitting around to say, hey, here you go. But I do idolize that. And as a matter of fact, I happen to be there in the early days when we came up with the Heritage Fund. I've been a period away. I call it a public education sabbatical between my elected periods. And I remember trying to fight for a 2/3 majority position, which is nothing can happen to the Heritage Fund in the sense of withdrawal based without it. And that's a challenge. So that now leads me towards my question, which is on, because I mean, we had changes on how we do these things, but on your slide, just pointing to the point, and this is where my question lies, is on your slide, page 23. You don't have to go to it. You'll know exactly what it is. It talks about Treasury Board approval for withdrawals. And that's sort of just tying it all together here, is that fundamentally, ethically, I trust my Treasury Board. I believe in their stewardship and principle of they mean well, they do well, whatnot. But frankly, as a politician, I don't trust them at all. They make their decisions in isolation. I hear there's even a conclave, special white smoke, the way they do decisions, and they make them in isolation. And although we operate as a perpetual minority government, it actually acts like a majority government and still does what it wants at the end. So my always worry is the threshold of how you say Treasury Board, if you could inform me or help us understand, is do they have full unfettered ability to make changes through that Treasury Board approval statement for withdrawals? Because that scares the hell out of me, that the government of the day can make that tweak, and what momentum the experts have built can be curtailed without some public uprising, storming of the legislature, big placards and whatnot. So your thoughts or your experience or how you safely predict, because they're still your bosses currently, see that, how do you thread that needle? Thank you.
Thanks. Over to Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an excellent question, and there have been various iterations of protection for the fund. Up until we made the change that said that the default setting for revenue in the fund was to leave it in the fund and reinvest it, there was no discussion, and the money simply flowed out. And so when the changes were made around the Fiscal Planning Act, we advocated quite strongly for a more restrictive process, a full vote in the legislature. And the other end of that sort of approval process would be at the discretion of the minister. And so the compromise was that the decision to move funds out of the Heritage Fund into general revenue would be made by Treasury Board as a subcommittee of Cabinet. And the thought process really is that Treasury Board is constantly making all of those fiscal decisions, whether they're budget related, whether they're capital related. That all flows through a targeted committee of Cabinet. And honestly, it was the strongest we could make it when we made those changes. What we're trying to get to, and what we discussed earlier in our presentation, is by changing some of the investment strategy, we make that an unpalatable decision regardless. So to sell illiquids that are off market, to sell illiquids that are well performing, is going to be a very difficult decision for any Treasury Board to make. And because of the attention we've drawn to the Heritage Fund, and because of the protections we've put in place, and frankly just the recent growth by changing the fiscal framework, by contributing to the fund, by protecting the earnings, we've made it politically untenable to draw those funds into general revenue. That said, we tabled our budget 25 in February, which shows 3 years of varying degrees of deficit, significant borrowing. In that budget, in the fiscal plan, there is no thought of touching the Heritage Fund, of using the Heritage Fund earnings to supplement revenue. But that does take some political fortitude, and that does take some, it takes a strong Minister of Finance backed by a cabinet that believes in what we've said we will do with this fund. And we've said this from the start. You know, fund was created by legislation. The amendments remain in legislation. It can be legislated away. There's nothing to say that a future government can't say, why do we have $30 billion sitting in cash when we're running deficits and building debt? Let's cash it in. We're trying to make that an untenable decision politically and financially. But it's the reality of a publicly managed fund, frankly. But the more we move down the spectrum of an independent corporation responsible for its management, a well-prescribed investment strategy that shows results and growth, that growth should outstrip the cost of borrowing to fund deficits, of running up debt on the provincial balance sheet. And Alberta, frankly, is uniquely positioned to accumulate debt through fiscally challenging times like we're going to face. But that's a decision of government, so we simply can't get away from it because, yes, any government in the future can change legislation and do whatever they want. But to the member's specific point, Treasury Board was viewed as a body that had sufficient financial acumen and sort of fiscal oversight to make those decisions, and it was a compromise.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins for follow-up.
And thank you for that. I mean, it's a challenging situation. I mean, in my view, I think we have the exact same problem, but that said, I'm sure so does everyone else. So I'm sure it's one of those we're part of that group or club. I'll just keep the next one very short because it's quite frank, which is my concern, of course, is about political intervention. And you sort of spoke about it as well. But political intervention about not happy with the fund, and you kind of highlighted, although you don't have to go at length, but you talked about quicker decisions with respect to making, this is a great opportunity, but the time they get to it, it's sold on the market and you've missed your window. So I'm curious on, the last point, I think it's a cornerstone or maybe the keystone of how this comes together, which is your 9% return, I think you said. So, how do you meet the objectives of all of these things without constantly wrestling with the political oversight vis-a-vis the minister or whoever? How do you find political intervention stays out of your decisions on making the decisions? How do they react to your decisions? I often call them, some of them are less good. They're always your biggest fan when you make the right decision. They're less good when you don't. So how do you find that balance? Because, I mean, if you trust the managers, then you need to look at the long game, and the long game is beyond political cycles. And that's the problem with these things, is the political cycles scare the heck out of politicians who have to face the voters, whether in, whether in a month from now, a year from now, 4 years from now. So that's always a challenge. So if you can appreciate the complexity of the question for the organization, your thoughts?
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an excellent point, and to be clear, I am a little flip when I talk about political interference generally. We haven't seen a tremendous amount of direct political interference in the investment decision-making for the Heritage Fund in many years. What I talk about needing to go to the minister, those would be fairly significant changes that we would be making in the investment strategy that would require oversight. By and large, most of the investment decision-making has been delegated to either ourselves as Treasury Board staff or to AIMCO as our investment manager. So there's not a lot of people coming to us saying, why aren't you building a refinery? Why isn't the Heritage Fund building a refinery so we can invest a product and sell an upgraded product into the markets? Government's done that in the past, but that's been directed through our economic development departments. The closest we've come to seeing political interference was at a previous administration that implemented something called the Alberta Growth Strategy or Alberta Growth Mandate, which required the Heritage Fund to invest in certain projects in Alberta, or a certain percentage of the fund be invested in projects in Alberta. And when we looked at it, we felt that that was political interference, that that was directing the fund to do economic development activities. But when we looked into it, the criteria that they had already been met by the Heritage Fund naturally investing in projects in Alberta that were economically viable, that were good financial decisions. But I would say that's the closest we've come to overt political interference in the investment process. But again, that can change depending on the government of the day, depending on the minister of the day, the premier of the day. Right now, the focus is very much on the professional management and the professional development of the fund. And I think the creation of this Heritage Fund Opportunities Corporation as a dedicated entity to oversee that, to come up with the investment strategies that don't need political sign-off, the creation of that corporation, once it's complete, makes all of those decisions rest within the corporation, and no requirement to come back to the minister, no requirement to come back to the premier. I think that will protect the fund further from these potential political interference. And again, these things are constructs of legislation that can easily be changed in the right environment.
I'd just like to add 2 points. So one of the things is that, first of all, the Canadian pension model has done a great job establishing what we call arm's length management. One of our past ADMs joked that it was T-Rex arms, but still there. And so, but with this arm's length investment management, a lot of the way that we write investment policies and goals are very much broken into us as asset allocators and our investment manager as the securities selection component. So that helps a lot, where we get a lot of latitude from the allocation standpoint, and then we, through arm's length management, we have something called an investment management agreement. So these IMAs are incredibly important, and it's essentially the minister's contract with its investment manager, and it sets out the roles and responsibilities of the individuals. So those legal documents are really important as well too, in delineating what the roles and responsibilities should be. And again, just piggybacking off of what the Canadian pension model has built for us as far as governance and arm's length management. So that expectation this is something that we've found is actually very strong in Canada and makes Canada a great jurisdiction for stuff like this, whereas it's not so strong in the other parts of the world. So it's a huge advantage we have. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. Quick comment from Mr. Huggins.
Thank you for that. That's quite enlightening, or helpful, or satisfying in the sense of folks are staying generally out of that. The only comment I'll make, and maybe just this is something I would prefer committee considers it over time, and maybe just your opinion on it in general is we've all heard the theory of what's called a poison pill in legislation, where it causes it to react in a certain way after a certain time or conditions have been met. And my worry, of course, my deep worry is that either we'll set certain thresholds so low, in other words, 50%, or the Treasury Board can say we can come get the money when we want. I would like to see eventually a recommendation coming forward that it stops quick tampering or achieving short-term successes without the long-term view. So, without meeting a test. And the example I'd give is, say, we'd like to take 10% of the Heritage Fund out, but the Act says any withdrawal must meet the condition of, in 12 months, accessibility. Furthermore, unless it meets the condition of 2/3 or greater majority. So in other words, the legislature can still get it if it really, really needs it. So if a hospital burns, or school, or something of public interest and definitely need, it's there. But it stops the whims of the government trying to achieve a quick, we need to balance the budget, we need this kind of money just because we run into an election and this is how we're going to do it. That type of condition, I'll call it now, because I don't need to use poison pill in this case, because it is a condition of access. Do you see that being helpful? Do you see that meeting the objectives of safe and stable investment? What value do you see it? Because I'd like to bring it up as a committee long-term recommendation. So anyway, your thoughts on your fund. Could it work? Does it work? Does it make sense? That type of thing. Or is it maybe just too much to expect? Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it's dangerous ground, but we'll tread on it. It's, look, the more difficult you can make it to access this cash, the better. You know, should it be sacrosanct? Should it be untouchable? I don't think so. I mean, you come back to my earlier, again, flippant comments around Norway. There could come a day when Norway needs $2 trillion in cash. And if they need to cash out everything in that fund, they will. But it will be exceedingly difficult. So you would need a very strong case politically, a very strong case with the public. You would need a very strong fiscal either crisis or requirement. So the longer you can make that process, the harder you can make that process, the more serious people are about accessing that money. And that would tell me, or would signal to me anyway, that fiscally it was just dire enough that they had to do it, whoever they may be at the time. So I do think that building as many safeguards to make it untenable politically and optically to touch those funds is sound. Is sound.
I want to add one point. In the really early days of our analysis, one of the things we did do was look at all the other sovereign wealth funds and all of their legislation and all their rules they have, and try to figure out what everybody else is doing across the board as well too to protect their funds. And so Singapore has some interesting, so Temasek, their only income that was generated within that period can be pulled, stuff like that. So one of the things that we're still exploring, and I think we'll always be exploring, is like what can we write into legislation that's based on some of these best practices in the world as well. And that's where, yeah, HFOC will be interesting because that will give the opportunity to really talk to all these peers about that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a couple of questions of my own, and what you just said kind of leads into the first one. And I thought that the legislative amendment that was recently made to retain all investment, are there still provisions built in for possible drawdown, or is it effectively you can't touch this until 2050? Can you kind of help us understand what those provisions are, or are there none? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. There really are none. So should the legislature decide, I think the minister, or no, sorry, Treasury Board decide, they can draw out the earnings of the Heritage Fund. I think to access the principal in place would probably require an act of the legislature. It's not quite clear. Yes.
Yeah, the income is quite clear in the act, but the principle is more difficult because it's own, yeah.
So no, there are no specific safeguards in that regard.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ms. Jones.
Sorry, thanks, Chair. The way that the income works, though, is when the act was changed. So before it said income must be transferred, and what we did was change it to say may, and then require the Treasury Board vote. So really, it was a slight amendment to, and income and inflation proofing have always been part of that act. But yeah, there's been so many evolutions over time on that one. But that's just to clarify, Treasury Board, all they're voting on is taking out income, not principal.
Thank you. And the next question is kind of the opposite of that question, and that is, you know, I think the fact that you're moving the fund into a corporation with revised governance is very interesting for us to be looking at. It's something that was mentioned to us. You know, it was we had a presentation from an organization that kind of analyzes all the sovereign wealth funds in the world, and they highlighted New Zealand and Australia are kind of the gold standard, or being seen as the gold standard right now, and they have this kind of management where it's completely separated from the government. So under that new structure, how will contributions be managed? Are they legislated? Are they required to make a certain contribution each year, or how is that going to work to ensure that, you know, the new corporation has something to manage? Thanks.
It's a fair question. So the new corporation will be responsible not just for the new investment, but they will also now be responsible for the investment strategy for the existing Heritage Fund assets. So the 25 billion that exists and is managed by AIMCO currently, they will have oversight for that. And then they will also manage independently a separate portfolio, which will be the new contributions. In terms of contributions into the fund, it doesn't change. So the contributions aren't really made to the Opportunities Corporation. They're made into the fund, which is governed by the Heritage Fund Opportunities Corporation. So the fiscal framework that allows up to 50% of surplus cash to be deposited into the Heritage Fund remains unchanged. So the mechanisms to put money into the fund haven't changed at all. It's simply who's responsible for managing them and the way in which they might be invested.
And the last point is that all of this is consolidated back onto the government, into the government financials. So everything about the Heritage Fund comes back into our financial statements. I just want to make that clarity because it's meaningful to have the corporation and know that the corporation is fully consolidated.
Okay, just very quickly though, what you said there was the government can invest surpluses, can invest reserves revenues. What I was wondering is like, are they required to by legislation invest in the fund?
So the government's discretion under the Fiscal Transparency Act is only around whether they use surplus cash to pay down debt or invest in the fund. They've actually also allowed themselves the ability to spend up to 50% of surplus cash on one-time projects that don't create ongoing liabilities of government. So, for example, if they very quickly needed to build a hospital and they had billions in surplus, they could spend it on that, but not create a program. So the only pieces in the Act that specifically speak to the Heritage Fund are that up to 50% of surplus cash can be invested into the fund, but it's not required at all. So one of the reasons that you saw the model we built around getting from where we are to 250 billion by 2050, that model assumes no contributions into the fund. So our base case is that no money is ever put in. So that way, incrementally, if billions of dollars, like this year we'll have another $1 billion that was not in that calculation. So that $1 billion will compound over 25 years and hopefully we'll strip out the $250 billion target. Those are basically viewed as bonuses in our plan. Our plan is the base case. We have $27 billion today. We plan to grow that to $250 billion by 2050. And any contributions into the fund would simply accelerate that process or enhance those returns.
Okay, thank you. We pretty much have time for one more question. Ms. Reid, did you have a last one? You don't? Mr. Hawkins, did you have another one? Or
Do you have anything else you want to say, Mr. Chair?
I have some closing comments, but if Mr. Hawkins has a final question, just to make it quick, we've got about 3 minutes. So.
I think fundamentally, I often think that this is probably one of the most paramount questions that we could ever ask. Is there anything you think would make our Heritage Fund dynamic enough to be innovative? Is there something that we should make sure we put our finger on so when we leave here we say, you know, I agree with them or I don't agree with them, but it's worthwhile and spending some time letting it resonate and saying, you know, their advice is exactly what it is, advice, which means we don't have to take it. But that said, is there anything you could provide that we should give some good thought to ensure that we at least spend some time saying, yeah, that was a good idea, we should incorporate it, or that was a good idea, but we're not ready, like those types of things. Any advice you'd provide? And don't worry, we'll turn off the Alberta streaming portion to this presentation, so your bosses will have no idea what you're saying. We'll just leave it out.
I put my newspaper.
Thank you. I'll let Ms. Jones start.
Well, my boss is sitting next to me. Let's see if we have the same answer. So my answer is definitely exploring adding alternatives to your portfolio. That's definitely something I would focus on, where that could fit and what's possible for you. That's him next.
Ms. Jones has a very specific view of the world when it comes to investments. I would say, consideration of professional financial management. We have for 10 years worked together at Treasury Board and Finance, overseeing the Heritage Fund off the sides of our desk. We've done an okay job at it, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
And it's not until we've actually brought in well-paid, well-respected financial professionals that you can really get the traction with the politicians and with the public. Because frankly, Albertans don't want to hear from civil servants how to manage the fund. They will listen to globally respected financiers. And that's one of the reasons we're structuring the board of HFOC the way we are. It won't just be Albertans, there won't be civil servants on it. Well, the deputy administration will be on it. But it'll be international experts in the field of sovereign wealth. And I think you need that expertise somehow opining, whether it's on a volunteer basis, whether it's on a mandate basis to invest these funds. You might want to look at how competitively you deal with investment managers and who's investing your funds and what they're in. But I think professionalism is actually very important here. And it's taken us a while to get the resources in place to manage our fund the way we want to. So it is an uphill fight, and there are limited resources, and we, more than anyone, understand the realities of working in a government environment and the constraints that brings. But you can get to a level of professionalism that is absolutely crucial to the success of the fund.
Thank you very much, and that does bring us, unfortunately, to the end of our time. We've really been enjoying this presentation, I can say, on behalf of committee. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for coming here, first and foremost, and for such an excellent presentation. You've given us, I think, a lot to contemplate as we review our own fund. And some of the things that stood out to me, and the statement that I'm taking away from this, is governance drives performance. I really appreciated that statement and agree with it, and I think yeah, that's a pull quote that I'm going to be hanging on to. But the other thing that I note is just that you've set a target for growth, which I think is a great example to look at. Also, is what are we trying to achieve with the fund, and moving towards that goal as opposed to simply saying we hope the fund grows. Those are two very, very different things. And so setting that target, yeah, really gives you something to strive towards. So, yeah, on behalf of committee, again, I just want to thank you both for coming up and sharing this valuable information with us. And I'll give you the floor for closing comments if you'd like.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's been our pleasure. This is a project that we are both very passionate about, and that we work with a lot of people who are very passionate about. And it's been a tremendous success for us recently. It hasn't always been. It's always been something we've wanted to do. But as we go down this journey, we do remember that we're Canadians, and we're proud Canadians in Alberta, and we're happy to share whatever we can with your government on best practices, on what our challenges have been, on any ideas that we have. So we are not that far away from here. We're due south. Finally, we're the weird Southerners. And we're happy to help in any way we can. We do believe we're all in this together. We talked a lot about global partnerships. The partnerships we're looking at are with people who are much more sophisticated and in better financial position than we are, and we're appreciative of their attention. And so I think it behooves us to share that knowledge with other Canadians who are on the same path. And so we're happy to come back anytime. We've enjoyed our time here, for sure. And we hope that we continue the dialogue with you.
Okay, well, thanks again. And that concludes the public portion of our presentation. So with that, yeah, we'll end the broadcast. And if committee can just stick around for a quick debrief, we'll do that as soon as the witnesses have left. Thank you.